Yo, what is going on, guys? My name is McDuck33 and welcome back to another Destiny 2 video. Pardon if my voice sounds a little just stuffed up. I've been recovering from a cold recently, but I'll do my best to make it sound natural. Dungeons are my favorite activity within Destiny 2. As someone who has limited time to play the game between things like school, along with having a comparably small friend group, raids are somewhat of a rarity for me. Enter dungeons. Being 3-player activities, dungeons are way more accessible to me. As you saw with the Duality video, I can get with Cooper and Deep, and we can run through the weekly dungeon, inflicting some awesome and hilarious moments along the way. So, with the release of Spire of the Watcher just this past weekend, I wanted to go through and rank each of the dungeons. The criteria under which I will be ranking them is as follows: the length, the difficulty, the loot, the pacing, and the general feeling and vibe you get while playing. So, without further ado, let's jump right in. Taking our last place spot, to no one's surprise, is Shattered Throne. It's really disappointing to me that Shattered Throne is this bad because I really did enjoy it back when it came out. I've always loved the Ascendant Plane as a location, and the Shattered Throne is one of the most in-depth activities in which we actually get to explore it. Unfortunately, there just isn't enough to hold up this dungeon. While the first encounter is somewhat creative, it just boils down to walking around this giant map looking for a symbol, and killing a yellow bar taken, then moving on to the next one. The loot is by far the worst out of all the dungeons, with none of it being specific to the dungeon itself. I will give it credit for the Witch Ender quest, however. That was a pretty neat quest, even if it isn't the best exotic. The quest was still really fun. The dungeon is pretty short, with only 3 encounters that can be cleared pretty quickly if you know what you're doing. The bosses have aged really poorly and pretty much topple over now, which kind of sucks because I actually thought the final boss was a really fun fight. Having to manage the health of each knight was a pretty unique idea that I wish could be brought back in some way. One last thing I want to mention in favor of the dungeon is the pacing. It never seems to be a dull moment while going through the different rooms, and although the encounters themselves are not super intricate and difficult, some of the combat sections in between sort of make up for that. Overall, Shattered Throne is just too short, with non-specific loot and poorly aged boss difficulty, causing me to be able to place it no higher than number 6 on our list. Following Shattered Throne, we have Pit of Heresy. While definitely a huge improvement from Bungie's first dungeon, Pit of Heresy still lacks a lot of what makes some of the other dungeons so great. Right off the bat, the feeling of Pit is fantastic. After making the initial drop to the first encounter, you are trapped within the rocky confines of the pit. Throughout the whole activity, you feel like you are being imprisoned. The game actually leans into this sort of, with more claustrophobic spaces, aside from the giant set piece of the first encounter. The length and difficulty are also pretty good. There are a total of 4 encounters, plus the jumping puzzle before the final boss, making it one of the longest dungeons. While not being as difficult as some of the other entries, the encounters do pose more of a challenge than those in Shattered Throne. The final boss doesn't topple over, and he can actually kill you. The Ogre encounter is one of my favorites in any dungeon, being yet again another super unique mechanic. Not being able to kill the Ogres is a really cool twist, and weaving in and out of the lanes that they patrol is some of the most fun I've ever had in Destiny. The first encounter is alright. It introduces you to the concept of the symbols, which is used in the jumping puzzle, and also shows you the 3 glyph keepers, or whatever they're called, the key mechanic in the final boss. The third encounter is probably the worst, and with the team it's not that hard, but when doing it solo it can be an absolute nightmare. The main mechanic just revolves around standing on a plate while your teammates kill knights and grab orbs to dunk. It's not super fun, and the only threat are the hive knights that can absolutely destroy you if you're not careful. As far as loot goes, it's not much better than Shattered Throne. While there are a few weapons only attainable through the dungeon, such as the Pulse, the armor set is just the normal Dreambane set, which you can get anyways from completing the campaign, and the other weapon drops are once again other moon weapons. I will say that the Xenophage quest is a huge point in this dungeon's favor. The final step with the secret room inside the dungeon was a super cool addition and very fun to do. Overall, Pit of Heresy is a tremendous step up from its predecessor, but not better than the others to come after it, which is why it lands a spot at number 5 on today's list. Next up is Duality, one of the newest dungeons added into the game in Season 17, or Season of the Haunted. Duality is many people's favorite, and while I can understand that, it's personally just not my cup of tea. I think that my main issues are the feeling and the difficulty. While I think that it's cool to go into Callus's mind and all that, the feeling I get while playing the dungeon is not as powerful as when I play others. The difficulty is something that I widely dislike. I'm fine with difficult activities, and in some cases I think that it makes the activity more engaging and fun. But what Duality did feels really cheap, and I find that the main difficulty of the dungeon comes from the overwhelming mob of ads that's constantly in your way. In the final encounter, there are groups of 5 to 6 scions that emerge from each of the symbols' corresponding doors, which equals out to be about 24 scions total, along with all the other legionaries and other enemies scattered around. I do appreciate that there are tougher enemies, but I really do not like how the easy way of adding difficulty was to jam-pack each encounter with an all-you-can-eat buffet of ads. The only other thing I can knock the dungeon on is the bugs, which also happens to be a pretty big factor for me. The amount of bugs and glitches revolving around the bells is astounding, and when you do the dungeon pretty frequently, it starts to piss you off. Aside from those things, however, Duality is a great dungeon. The pacing, although slow in some instances, is pretty consistent, and the length is really good. While not a long dungeon by nature, the encounters have a tendency to take a while, which in turn causes the dungeon to be longer, which is a good thing. The bell mechanic, I think, is the second best, only behind another entry higher on this list, and is really well utilized throughout the entire activity. The loot is also incredible, being probably the best loot available from any dungeon, although I have yet to experiment with my fair share of the weapons in Spire. Options like the Storm Chaser, Unforgiven, and Lingering Dreads are some of the most elite picks in endgame PvE right now, featuring some great rolls and a fantastic origin trait. Overall, while Duality is definitely a fun experience, I think it falls 50-50 for me, which is why I am ranking it here at number 4. Next up, we have Grasp of Avarice. If this was a ranking purely based on the fun and feel of a dungeon, Grasp would win number 1 without a doubt. Encounters like the Sparrow Race and the final boss are some of my favorite dungeon encounters, and the music is absolutely stellar. I'll talk way more in depth about it in an upcoming video, but just know that the track is one of the best songs to be put in the game ever. The loot is also fantastic, with top tier picks like the Ias Luna and Matador being some of the best legendaries to bring into PvP, and let's not forget about the exotic of the dungeon, Galahorn. Making its royal return to Destiny 2, Galahorn is included in the dungeon as a quest, and although it's not nearly as entertaining or unique as Wishender and Xenophage, it was still fun to do for the first time. Alongside the quest itself, the 12 message in a bottles found throughout the dungeon will reward you with a special ornament for the exotic, should you find them all. However, like anything, there are a few flaws to the dungeon. For one, the dungeon is really short. With a good team of 3 who knows what they're doing, Grasp can be completed in under 30 minutes. This is mainly due to the difficulty being rather low compared to some of the newer dungeons. While the bosses do pose somewhat of a challenge, it's not too difficult to air fry them with linear fusions, galley plus 2 legendary rockets, or whatever other means of damage you prefer. To play devil's advocate, I will say that this is also somewhat of a positive. Being able to hop on and actually do a quick Grasp of Avarice run is really nice. The next big glooming negative is the servitor encounter. The pacing of the dungeon is fantastic, with there being almost no dull moments aside from some of the jumping puzzles at the beginning. After just clearing the Sparrow encounter, which as I mentioned briefly is one of the most exhilarating parts of any dungeon, the momentum just comes to a screeching halt at this encounter. Moving from island to island, clearing out the enemies, then killing the servitor, and then having to roll the servitor to the cannon, all of it's really cool in design, it's just so tedious. Other than that, and the other details I mentioned before, the dungeon is great. One of the most fun dungeons, enough to place it at the halfway point on today's list. The runner-up for today's list has to go to Prophecy. I love this dungeon with all my heart, and had number 1 not come out, it probably would have made the top spot, but unfortunately I do like that dungeon more. We'll discuss that entry more when we get there, but for now let's focus on Prophecy. There are a multitude of reasons why I love Prophecy, starting with the mechanics. While the positioning between light and dark can be a little janky at times, having to properly position yourself was a really unique idea for a mechanic, and I love the idea of dark modes and light modes. I also love the 9 as a faction, or whatever they are, and the realm of heaven and hell is super awesome. Back when Reckoning was a thing, I would do that over and over just because I was so interested in the 9. This just adds into the atmosphere being very mysterious and dark. I remember doing it for the first time when it came out back in Season of the Arrivals, and the story behind us being there was so intriguing to me. The pacing is also stellar, with the dungeon being split into segments of stressful, frantic situations, followed by more calming, albeit still somewhat difficult combat, and then the cycle repeats. The Sparrow section is even better than the one from Grasp, which is saying something, but traversing the Rainbow Road of Destiny for the first time is something I won't forget for a long time. I also think it's the most fun dungeon to solo flawless. It's not overly difficult like Duality, but provides enough of a challenge to keep you on your toes for the length of the activity. Part of this is lended by the pacing, which as I said before is separated between action and calm. The one box in which I think Prophecy doesn't check is the loot. While it does have some great options like the Judgment hand cannon and the Darkest Before Pulse, most of the weapons are just outclassed by better options. Judgment is downright laughed at by the likes of Fatebringer and Zauli's Bane, and Darkest Before is just a worse version of things like Grid Skipper, Peace of Mind, and other rapid fire pulses. Despite the lackluster loot, Prophecy is still a great dungeon. With amazing bosses, difficulty, and pacing, it is well worth a spot on number 2 on today's list. If you've been keeping track, then you'll know that the number 1 spot on today's list goes to the recently released Spire of the Watcher dungeon. I seriously do not have enough good things to say about this dungeon. The aesthetic is just phenomenal, although I am kind of a sucker for Warmind bunkers and such. Ascending the remains of a long abandoned Warmind spire was super awesome, and exploring the inside was even cooler. The pacing was really good, with enemies being a lot more spread out than Duality, where it felt like an overwhelming amount of adds were just all trying to kill you at once. The jumping puzzles were short enough that they didn't overstay their welcome, but were long enough to not only be a few rooms. The mechanic is my favorite of any dungeon, forcing you to track the yellow cord and keep you aware of your surrounding, especially in the final boss room. The loot, although I haven't had a single piece of weaponry drop for me yet, seems very unique, with the 2-shot special grenade launcher, a sidearm that can roll with Desperado, and what is basically a legendary Dead Man's Tail. The armor set is very flashy, being completely Western themed, and finally allowing hunters to complete their dreams as a space cowboy. If there was one thing that I had to knock about this dungeon, it'd be the bosses. While I'm okay with tough boss fights, there comes a point where a boss has too much health. Taking almost 6 phases to kill the first boss on my team's first run, it just felt like too much, and I've seen a few posts complaining about how much health the bosses have. The final boss is also spectacular, while suffering from this same issue, and although some may find him too difficult, playing Ring Around the Rosie with him while the rest of your team finishes the relay can be a lot of fun. All in all, Spire of the Watcher is an almost perfect experience for me, with fantastic atmosphere, loot, bosses, and more. It is definitely worthy to be number 1 on today's list. Anyways guys, that is going to do it for today's video. I hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, be sure to leave a like, and if you guys really enjoyed, be sure to subscribe because that'd be awesome. If you want to see me do more Destiny 2 content similar to this, let me know down in the comment section down below. If you want to get in touch with me, the best places on Twitter or Discord, both will be linked in the description. I stream over on Twitch at twitch.tv/mcduck0_1. Me and Zanger do free dungeon help every Sunday starting this Sunday at 12 noon PST, so stop by just to say hello or if you need help with either of the weekly dungeons. Y'all have a wonderful day, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.